Now, when we talk about the money market, we're not talking about, in a general sense, the market for money by itself. We're actually talking about a portfolio allocation issue, which is really asking, of all of my financial assets, what proportion of them do we want to hold in the form of money, as opposed to, say, the form of bonds or stocks or real estate or other ways of holding assets. Okay? But we want to focus on that money market. It's easiest to think about the money market as only having two assets. Money, which we will assume pays a zero interest, may pay a really tiny one, but let's just think about it as a zero interest, and bonds, which pay a higher interest, right? Just those two. It works with more assets, but why complicate it? So what we want to start with is thinking about what we call the demand for money, or the demand for real money balances, or sometimes called liquidity preference. The old name is liquidity preference, still probably the best. So what liquidity preference means is, what is our demand for highly liquid assets? Money is the most liquid of all financial assets. So liquidity preference was essentially the same as the demand for real money balances. So here we can think about, why do we hold any of our financial assets in the form of money if it has a zero rate of return? Why do we hold any financial assets in the form of money if it has a zero rate of return? Well, one reason is because we want to make transactions with it. Right? That's how we spend or buy things, is by giving the merchant or the business money, assets that we call money, and the business giving us goods and services. So we need to hold some of our assets in the form of money in order to facilitate transactions, even though the money doesn't give us any rate of return. Okay? This is what we call the transactions demand for money, the transactions demand for money. In this case, it depends upon real GDP. How many purchases are we actually making? Right? So real GDP, we'll talk about what the real demand for money will be for transactions. Notice, more money, the bigger the economy, the more expenditures are being made, the more money will be demanded. That's why we have a plus sign under it. But we also have to recognize there's a cost associated with holding financial assets in the form of money. Right? It's the foregone interest that you could have earned. So remember, that bond is earning an interest rate. Your money is not. The difference between the interest rate on the bond and zero is your opportunity cost of holding money. So when interest rates are really low, the opportunity cost is very small. So who cares? Let's just hold a lot of money. I'm not going to spend much time or effort to economize or rearrange my portfolio. But if interest rates are quite high, the opportunity cost of holding money is also quite substantial, in which case I'm now willing to spend more time and energy managing my portfolio to try to achieve the highest rate of return. Well, this opportunity cost is obviously related to the interest rate, the nominal interest rate. And as you know, or hopefully you know, the higher the interest rate, the greater the opportunity cost, the less money you will want to hold. So there's a negative sign under the nominal interest rate. So this then gives us the demand side of the money market that's looking at what proportion of our assets do we want to hold in the form of money. Oops. Okay, so let's put on our diagram the nominal interest rate on the vertical axis and the demand for real money balances on the horizontal axis. Now, because we've talked about price stickiness in the short run, we can basically assume that the price level doesn't change. Right? So we don't have to really worry about the price level here being in the denominator. So the demand for money then is going to be downward sloping, looking something like this. So this is what we call liquidity preference, or the demand for real money balances, L0. Now, it's important to remember that there's also a transactions demand for money. So when we draw this demand for money curve, or this liquidity preference curve, we should actually identify what the level of real economic activity is. So what this says then is, if the nominal interest rate is at I0 and income is at Y0, then the demand for real money balances, or liquidity preference, will be at L0. Now, let's think about what happens if real economic activity goes up. IS curve shifts to the right, MP curve shifts to the right or down. Right? We saw the aggregate demand curve would shift to the right. Economic activity increases. At the same interest rate level, I0, we now have more income, so we'll have more expenditures, which means the transaction demand component will increase. So we might be out here. So as the income rises, liquidity preference will also increase. And now we'll want to hold a higher proportion of our financial assets in the form of money. So notice then that the demand for money is likely to shift in and out as the economy goes through booms and busts. As we see those business fluctuations, we should also see fluctuations in the demand for money. Well, that's the demand side. We can also think about the supply side. Now, on the supply side, we're going to use, at this stage, the same assumption we did when we talked about the quantity theory of money. Remember, when we discussed the quantity theory of money, what we said was the money supply can be considered to be exogenous because it's under the control of the central bank. We'll see in the next couple of, either Tuesday or maybe the following week, that's not exactly the way it works, but for now, let's just continue to use that assumption. Right? So in this case, if we assume that the supply of money is under the complete control of the central bank, then it will be whatever it'll be, irrespective of what the nominal interest rate is. In other words, the supply of money will be a vertical line at whatever level the central bank determines it wants it to be. Now, of course, we need to think about equilibrium. And like every other market, equilibrium is where supply equals demand. So let's put our supply curve in. Let's draw in a demand curve. And we know that equilibrium then will be where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. In this case, at point A, and at a nominal interest rate of I0. standard supply and demand analysis. But let's assume for a moment that we're not at I0. Let's assume that the interest rate, for whatever reason, just happens to be at I1. So we can see at that point that we have an excess supply of money. So there's an excess supply of money in the economy. Now remember, you don't get to raise your hand and say, well, gee, if there's too much money in the economy, just give it to me, right? We're not talking about how much we want, except as a portfolio allocation issue. So what this really says is that the demand for money is small at this particular interest rate. So we want to hold less of our financial assets in the form of money. But the money's out there, so somebody's holding it. So people are holding money, but they don't want to. Remember, the interest rate's high. So they would rather have that invested in bonds. So now they take some of their money and they buy bonds. So what happens then to the price of bonds? The price of bonds goes up. When the price of a bond goes up, what happens to the interest rate on the bond? It goes down. So if there's excess supply of money in the economy, holders of that excess supply will try to get out of money by buying bonds, driving up the price of the bonds, driving down the interest rate. Now notice, as the interest rate falls, the opportunity cost of holding money is also reduced, and now people are willing, as a portfolio allocation issue, willing to hold a larger proportion of their assets in the form of money. So how far will interest rates fall? All the way to I0. At this interest rate, people are willing to hold exactly the amount of money that's in circulation in the economy. Now the same thing is true if the interest rate is too low. So, well, I shouldn't say the same thing, but it's just the opposite. If the interest rate is at I2, below our equilibrium, we now have excess demand for money. So when there's excess demand, it means in our portfolio allocation we have too many bonds, not enough money. So what do? We sell some of our bonds. When we sell our bonds, we drive down their price. When we drive down the price, the interest rate goes up. And the interest rate will rise, again, until we get to I0. As the interest rate is rising, the opportunity cost of holding money has increased, so people will be satisfied with holding less of it. Now there's one really interesting thing about this market. It clears, or goes to equilibrium, very quickly. Very quickly. So quickly, in fact, that we can basically say that it's always in equilibrium. So we're never going to be away from I0 for any length of time. People make their changes in their portfolio allocation, driving the interest rate to that level. So now we need to think about how the central bank controls the nominal interest rate. So let's suppose that for some reason we want to control the interest rate at the nominal interest rate at I0. Right? So we're there. That's our equilibrium level. No big deal. Everybody's happy. And then all of a sudden, for whatever reason, the demand for money increases. Now notice that if there's no reaction from the central bank, the interest rate would go up to I1. But the central bank wants to keep the nominal interest rate at I0. So what does it need to do? It simply needs to increase the money supply. So if the central bank increases the money supply by the same amount that the demand for money increases by, and they can do this fairly quickly, then ultimately there'd be no change in the interest rate. Now remember, this is an interest rate that the government, the central bank that is, can see all day long, every day. So when the demand for money changes, the interest rate starts to rise. Or when the demand for money increases, the interest rate starts to increase. The central bank knows right away, I need to put more money into the system. If the demand for money falls, they would see the interest rate dropping below the level they want to keep it at, and in that case, they would reduce the money supply and keep it up. So simply by changing the money supply, the central bank can manage the interest rate the nominal interest rate that it wants to achieve. Remember, it's achieving a nominal interest rate in order to get to the right real interest rate. Now finally, let's consider the situation where the economy has been at I0, but now they want to change it. So if the central bank now for some reason wants to raise the nominal rate in order to raise the real rate, it's not terribly difficult. All they would need to do is reduce the money supply. How much do they need to reduce it? Well, remember, they can see this interest rate all day long, every day. So they reduce the money supply, see the interest rate rise day by day, take a guess at how big a change they need. If they've underestimated, they can reduce it some more. If they've overestimated, they can add some back. So simply by changing the money supply, the central bank can maintain the interest rate that they have, if they would like, or they can change it if they want. So it's basically by changing the money supply, primarily through open market operations, that allows the central bank to achieve the nominal interest rate that they want. They affect that, given what's happening to inflation, in order to meet with the real interest rate that they like. Do you have a question? No, guess not. Okay, so that's it for today. Have a great weekend, and go Bears.